Welcome to all our viewers and listeners to this broadcast by the Marxist Workers Party. Today, 16th of August 2020, is the 8th anniversary of the Marikana Massacre. Today, 8 years ago, 34 mine workers were murdered by state forces during a strike wave determined to win a living wage of 12,500 rands per month. In the perspective of the MWP, the Marikana Massacre was a watershed, dividing the post-apartheid history of South Africa, the post-1994 era, into two halves. To commemorate the heroic workers who sacrificed their lives, we have organised a panel discussion with 3 MWP members. Participating today is Weizmann Hamilton, the General Secretary of the party, Andile Nazo, a member based in Rustenburg in the northwest, who, at the time of the Marikana Massacre, was a newly elected shop steward in the National Union of Mineworkers. And finally, a young comrade, Kamogelo Mofihli, who is joining us from Marikana, where he grew up in the shadow of the massacre. Kamogelo, I'd like to begin with you. The legacy of the massacre has shaped developments within the working class, and especially the organised workers movement, the trade unions, over the past 8 years. But of course, at the time, its impact was felt instantly and hardest in the Marikana community itself. I understand that you were only 12 years old at the time, and you are talking to us from less than 1 kilometre from the scene of the massacre. Can you set the scene for this discussion by describing for us how the massacre affected your community and what legacy it left there?
Well, the Marikana Massacre events that occurred back in 2012 not only divided the workers themselves, but also divided the people of the community, because there were workers who were who didn't want to strike, to protest, because it was reported that the NUM leaders turned violent to other NUM members. So there were those workers who didn't want to protest, and that led to the division of workers themselves. Because one thing that I felt was that the protesters, the miners who didn't want to protest were searched and attacked by other workers. So that's what I'm saying, that the protests caused division between the community members and the workers themselves, and that the workers who were gunned down by police members after Ramaphosa said he wanted a concomitant action. When he said on his emails, the emails that were released, he said he wanted a concomitant action to be taken. That's when the police officers, but the police that were brought into Marikana were not those of the nearby police station of Marikana. They brought other police officers from other places. We don't know where they came from. They were just police officers. We didn't know where they came from. So all the people, the miners who were gunned down, 34 miners who were killed, were caged like animals before they were murdered, cold-bloodedly. And others were hunted down and killed in the back, as comrade Weizmann Hamilton has said before. And others were, like, there's a family friend of mine who was killed, who was run over by a police vehicle. Like, he was killed in a horrible way. So those people left their families, they left children, they were grandparents, they were fathers to children who are still in school today. Those children are left without fathers because of the capitalistic class that still lives in the past, where they think they can find cheap labor, because people need jobs. Just because people need jobs doesn't mean that you should pay them very little money because they are desperate. So that, as I've said before, like there's still a lot of division between the community members. So, but when the protesters, like, they were striking, they didn't only want, they weren't only protesting for fair wages, but they've also been protesting for a better community to live in. They wanted better housing for themselves. They are, like, in Nkani, the miners still live in shacks, while recently there have been buildings, flats that have been built for mine workers, but there are still mine workers who live in shacks in this time. And it will be better, maybe, just maybe, be better if the shacks had electricity, but they don't have electricity. Even if you can go now to Vonarkop, when you come up, like when you cross the road, there are cable lines crossing the road, going from one house to another. Like, the entire community is like that. But while it's like that, they have a government. There is a government that has been put into power to cater the needs for poor people. But they don't. It doesn't go. They don't do anything for the people here. Same as the Lone Min. And when the ANC when Lone Min was bankrupt and was taken over by Sibanye is currently operating the nearby mine. And when Sibanye took over the mine, a lot of workers have been retrenched. Like last year, around September, 5,000 workers were left without jobs. And those workers aren't just workers who only take care of themselves. They are workers who also who have families, children, who also take care of their grandparents.
Thank you, Kamogelo, for that powerful and very important contribution. Now, you described the role that Cyril Ramaphosa played in the massacre. He was a shareholder of Lonmin and an influential leader who demanded that the police treat striking workers like criminals. It's also worth reminding our listeners and viewers that Ramaphosa was a former General Secretary of the mine workers in the 1980s. Now, what on earth did the Marikana community make of the fact that the billionaire butcher of Marikana ascended to the South African presidency without ever having had to account for his crimes?
The workers obviously felt betrayed by the state itself. And the governing body, the ANC, how can the ANC that knows a man left uncharged, who was and still responsible for the deaths of 34 workers who were parents to 2 people? Why was he chosen to become the president? Like, it didn't make sense to them. They felt betrayed and they felt like helpless.
Weizmann, I'd like to turn to you next and ask you to explain the significance of the massacre for the transformation of the country's political landscape.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sean. As you have correctly indicated in your introductory remarks, the Marikana Massacre represented a watershed in post-apartheid South African history. As we wrote at the time, a line in the sand has been drawn by the bloodied bones of the martyrs of Marikana. Beyond this lies the disintegration of the ANC and the tripartite alliance on the one hand, and the enormous possibility for the growth of socialist ideas and support for the idea of a mass workers' party on a socialist program on the other. I think that that analysis has been confirmed by events that have unfolded over the subsequent 8 years. Because shortly after the massacre occurred, in fact, exactly a year after the massacre had taken place, for the first time in South African history, a political party contested the elections with a clear socialist program to the left of the ANC. Up until that point, the opposition parties that had been created were all on the same side of the ideological divide, on the side of capitalism, in other words, as the ANC. That alone, I think, vests that event with enormous historical significance. Of course, as we always point out in the Committee for a Workers' International that the Marxist Workers Party is affiliated to, the Marxists always draw the same conclusions as the strategists of the capitalist class, but from opposite class standpoints. And there was a very significant editorial that was written the day after the massacre that appeared on the pages of Business Day, which I believe it is worth reading in order to appreciate how the capitalist class itself recognized that the very foundations upon which the post-apartheid dispensation had been constructed had been shaken by these events. And it read as follows: "The strike represents a failure of our new society, and most strikingly, the inability of the majority black establishment, of which the NUM and the ruling ANC and the union umbrella COSATU are the leaders, to come to terms with the majority of the black, marginalized, poor, and desperate majority." The NUM must recognize the extremely uncomfortable truth that there is a power building in the land over which they have little or no influence, and which itself has little or no respect for the powers that be. And I think this is worth very briefly considering the it is worth very briefly considering the significance of what was said in this editorial, because what it shed light upon is the fact that the post-apartheid dispensation was constructed on the understanding that a new political elite consisting of the ANC and its tripartite alliance partners would take over responsibility from the white minority regime for the management of the capitalist order. What this strike wave that preceded the Marikana Massacre represented was an uprising in reality, an insurrection without arms on the part of the mine workers that was directed in the first instance at the mining bosses with the demand for a minimum wage of 12,500, but even more significantly was directed against the authority of the National Union of Mineworkers, the union that these workers belonged to. They rejected the authority of the NUM and established independent strike committees, which led the strike. By doing so, they were rejecting not only the authority of the NUM, they were rejecting the authority of COSATU, the trade union federation that the NUM was affiliated to, and beyond that, the entire tripartite alliance. In that sense, the strike of 2012 represented a political rebellion against the post-apartheid dispensation, and therein lies its great historical significance. But as I indicated earlier, it is one thing to recognize the political significance of an event. It is quite another thing to act upon it. And that is exactly what the predecessors at that time of the Marxist Workers Party, at that time operating as the Democratic Socialist Movement, concluded from these events. That the idea that had always been present, initially as a minority tendency at the onset of the post-apartheid period, in the form of a resolution tabled at the COSATU Congress in 1993, a year before the historic elections, by NUMSA, calling for the establishment of a Workers' Party to contest the elections against the ANC, that idea, which had been defeated at that Congress, had now gained significant support.
Thanks, Weizmann. You've mentioned there the important role that our predecessor organisation, the Democratic Socialist Movement, played in the events around the strike wave. We should also mention that the DSM, other than playing an important role in linking up the independent mine workers' strike committees, launched a joint electoral initiative, the Workers' and Socialist Party, to contest the 2014 elections. Now, Weizmann mentioned that. And I think this is a good point to bring in Comrade Andile to the discussion. So, Andile, you were an NUM shop steward, so you had an insider's view of the political degeneration that was taking place within the union, COSATU, and the steps that the mine workers were taking to break free from that prison house. Can you share with us your understanding of the developments that led to the massacre?
Thank you very much, Comrade Sean. Thank you to Comrade Weizmann and Comrade Kamogelo, my fellow panelists. Comrade, yes, in 2012 I was working at a platinum plant and I was an NUM shop steward. What was happening then within the NUM leadership at the regional offices and the national offices, Comrade? There were these battles, the factional battles within the NUM itself, which is what brought the union to lose focus in the working class issues, and we saw these boardroom battles of the leadership. And it was not an easy period for us because we had only got elected in April of 2012. Now, as you can understand, we were the new leadership and we were the first union ever to be established in our platinum plant. Now, we had to gain the confidence of our members and we had to convince them that the NUM was the right union for them. And it was unfortunate what was happening in Rustenburg because the leadership seemed to have been disfocused themselves by fighting the factional battles and not serving the interests of the members. And it was quite a totally unfortunate era by then. Now, when it comes to collusion, I think collusion was caused by the NUM leadership who had too much access to management than their members on the ground. I think it was very easy by then to be bribed by the organizations, and hence the working class were struggling on the ground. So I believe that it was only natural for the NUM to have defended the massacre and not to see it for what it was, because the union was in what I'll call a denial, comrade, and this was my subjective point of view at the moment. Now, the culture in the NUM prior to Marikana, comrade, the culture of the NUM was not different from what was happening within our political sphere. There was a general feeling of dissatisfaction. There was a general feeling that the SACP had been weakened by the politics of the ANC then, and then the COSATU was not even strong. Our regional COSATU offices here were mostly dysfunctional, and that is when the NUM lost the support of its members. And the case in Marian Roberts employees who were dismissed while the NUM was their representative is actually what sparked the what would later be known as the Marikana Massacre. Because the employees in Marian Roberts were dismissed, now they lost the interest in the NUM. They lost that trust that they have been having with the NUM after they have been sacked. Now what they did was that they went to the Workers and Socialist Party to ask for help, for intervention, because they trusted more the working class formations rather than the NUM. Now, this is what made the NUM in the regional office to lose ground, because now the leadership could not get access to their former members, as the members felt that the NUM actually betrayed their struggle and their confidence. Now, what was happening and what you want here being reported by the journalists or other media houses is that this was a spontaneous action by the members who were not at the time affiliated because they had lost their jobs under NUM. Now, they only formed what we call the strike committees to try and protest what management of Marian Roberts did to them. Now, workers and the Socialist Party came and assisted the members, and that's when they, what I would call a bit of a formal direction came into being. They started to organize and agitate for the general strikes to be held in protest of what was happening. Now, this was a period where AMCU was nowhere to be found. AMCU had no single member at the time. I believe that AMCU may have started to recruit at that time. But what happens is that most people take it that these were AMCU members. And I would like to correct that, to say that these members were organized mostly by the working class formations and not by the NUM nor AMCU. So these were striking committees established under the watch of what we call the Workers and the Socialist Party at that moment. And you won't hear this being reported in that fashion. Because what the NUM leadership took, they were calling this the vigilante unionists, saying that the comrades were hijacking an agenda which we did not know at the time what it was. And then what we heard from the strikes, most of these members of the striking committees, they were saying that they wanted to do away with the bargaining system of the NUM, which allows, if you're working for Impala, you only negotiate for Impala, and then if you are in Lonmin, you'll only negotiate for Lonmin. They saw that as what brought the NUM into disrepute, that the negotiating organizers could be bribed, and hence the members would gain, or not what they wanted to gain. Hence, the demand was the 12,500, because they were feeling that they were neglected by the NUM, could have long fought for that kind of an amount. And then having to say that, my leader, the NUM's response was not assisting, because now the NUM were believing that the amount is too high. Rather, what we heard from the NUM was what the management was saying. NUM was saying that the mines did not have that kind of money to give to the employees, and this is what made the employees very angry. And then what explains the leadership's conduct? The NUM leadership's conduct was not at its best, comrade. That's what I would like to put to the table. Because remember the days leading up to the Marikana. I remember on August the 11th, when the strikers actually marched to our regional office in Rustenburg. What happens is that the shop stewards apparently fired the shots at the striking miners first, and claiming to say that that was self-defense. But what we don't know is that what could have happened if the members of the striking committees could have been allowed to get into the premises of the region. Maybe they wanted the leadership, we don't know. Maybe they wanted to attack the leadership as somewhere armed with knobkiris and everything. But what we know is that the NUM fired the first shot in that. And this was the kind of response that had been condoned by Comrade Zokwana, who was then the NUM president. The other thing is that on August the 13th, again, when the strikers were going to carry a mine, the police intercepted them. And again, this is when shots were fired. And so this was way before the Marikana Massacre. And then what I'd like to say is that the NUM behaved in a very disorderly manner, having been the voice of the working class for so long. I believe so much could have been done better. Should have the leadership of the NUM even listened to us who were in the branch leadership of different areas of the NUM. I thank you, comrade, and that is my own analysis of the situation. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Andile. That's very useful. You mentioned that AMCU did not in fact play any major role in the strikes around the massacre, and that the workers were organised in independent strike committees. The rise of AMCU, in fact, came after this. But the myth, of course, has emerged that AMCU led the strikes, and they are very happy to promote that. We should note that they, as usual, are leading the commemoration in the Northwest today. I'll bring Kamogelo back in. Comrades, do you have anything to add on the issue of AMCU? Is it performing for the mine workers? You mentioned earlier that 5,000 jobs had been lost in the recent period. Did AMCU do anything about that?
It was last year when 5,000, around September, when 5,000 workers changed. the time there were outcries there were voices from armed groups saying that the workers cannot be retrenched. But as always, organizations that don't follow their own policies, they turn a blind eye when the workers were retrenched. Even now, nothing has ever been done. No workers have been rehired, or more workers have been hired again. But like it has been turned to a norm that workers are retrenched every now and then, and people like the current trade unions are only there to play to be the front to front the capitalistic ideas of the I'll say the enemy of the workers. They're only there they're just there to watch.
And of course, the other unfinished business of the Marikana Massacre and the 2012 mineworkers strikes is the question of a workers' party. Kamogelo, please give us a final contribution of this discussion and tell us how you think the Marikana community would view the creation of a workers' party 8 years on from the massacre.
The community members will definitely support it, because right now, like, they need a party that can liberate them, the party that won't lead, that won't and will not operate for its own selfish agendas. They'll appreciate a party where they know that whenever they go against the oppression of their employers, they know that they'll have the support of the trade unions of their party, knowing that their jobs are safe. They can't be threatened to be fired whenever they say that something is wrong. That's something they will really appreciate for themselves, and for the community it will be very delightful.
Thank you, comrades, and thank you to our other two panellists. In closing, it's clear that the legacy of the Marikana Massacre was and remains hugely significant, not just for the community where it took place, but indeed for its role in shaping the development of the workers' movement since. We believe that the best way to honour the memory of the fallen Marikana heroes is to continue the struggle that they began, the struggle for genuine, democratic and worker-controlled unions, guided by a programme of revolutionary trade unionism, and, of course, continuing the struggle for a mass workers' party. At this point, the coalface of that struggle is to be found in the SAFTU Trade Union Federation, which, following on from the position adopted by the members of the Metal Workers Union NUMSA, has adopted a resolution in favour of helping to create such a party. A working class summit convened by SAFTU in July 2018, with nearly 150 working class organisations in attendance, adopted a similar resolution. We appeal to everyone watching and listening to this to join with us in the struggle to ensure that these resolutions are implemented and that the working class is seriously prepared to replace the corrupt ANC, headed now by the butcher of Marikana, Cyril Ramaphosa himself, to build the struggle for a workers' government and a socialist society.